Good morning, Williamsburg. Now, unlike Cliff Fleet, who feels he is so well known that he does not need to introduce himself, I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Scott Stevenson. I'm president and CEO of the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. Has anybody visited? Not enough people are clapping. But unlike Williamsburg, which will soon celebrate its centennial in just a couple of years, we just opened in 2017, and there was this couple of year thing that maybe kept you all from visiting during the pandemic. So I hope you'll come back soon. I am really honored to be here to introduce this morning's keynote speaker, Kevin Gover. At the Museum of the American Revolution, we've been blessed to have a great partnership with the Oneida Indian Nation in New York, part of the Haudenosaunee, or Six Nations, and through friendship with our board member, Ray Halberger, who's the nation representative for the Oneida Indian Nation. We first met Kevin back before the pandemic, who's come a couple times for panels and programs at the museum for Indigenous Peoples Day. The museum recently has expanded its commitment to telling Indigenous stories, particularly relating to the founding era. We received a wonderful gift from Comcast. Nice to know my phone bill is going towards something wonderful, to expand programming, sort of, which tended to be focused around November, of course, and Indigenous Peoples Weekend, and so now we're expanding that programming through the entire year. One of the initiatives that I want to share with you that actually will soon have a growing online initiative is called our Patriots of Color initiative. We acquired a couple of years ago an archive of original documents related to the service of men of African, Indigenous, and mixed ancestry in the Continental Army. This is a story that is not particularly well known, and I would say particularly the role that men of Indigenous ancestry, particularly from New England, played as soldiers in the Continental Army. So we've digitized that through partnership with Ancestry.com. So that Patriots of Color archive is already accessible. We're doing a deep dive into researching the lives of several hundred of these men who are represented, and in some cases women who were following the Army as well, and developing educational resources that will be available for educators and students here in the next couple of years. All of that just to say that this is important work that we're all doing. Of course, the Indigenous story of the nation is not merely one of dispossession, but actually of active engagement and involvement and shaping of the nation that we all are part of today and are hoping desperately to save so that it outlasts the Romans, as I think we heard in a conversation last night. So Kevin Gover was born in Oklahoma, a citizen of the Pawnee Nation. He went to Princeton, which, by the way, has been educating Indigenous Americans since the 18th century, so followed in long footsteps there, and received a JD from the University of New Mexico. I first met him when he was director of the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian. He now serves as Undersecretary for Museums and Culture at the Smithsonian, and long before that served during the Clinton administration as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs at the U.S. Department of the Interior. And so just like to welcome our good friend, Kevin Gover.
Well, thank you, Scott. Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to be here with you all. As you heard, I am a citizen of the Pawnee Nation. I also am a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and proud to be both. Our Smithsonian Secretary, Lonnie Bunch, does send his regards. He wishes he could have been here, but he dispatched me as well because this is such an important gathering. We do want to thank VA 250 and Colonial Williamsburg for just the outstanding hospitality. It's really wonderful. I am honored to be here. I always like to be around a lot of smart talk, and I've certainly heard a great deal of it. I also take comfort in learning that other museums are grappling with some of the issues that are baffling us at the moment about how to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I should mention that I'm here as well with my colleague Lisa Sasaki, and truth be told, Lisa is really the brains behind our 250 effort, but they let me out to speak every now and then. As you can imagine, the Smithsonian occupies something of a unique place as our national museum system. We're located right there on the National Mall. The National Park Service, by the way, is estimating that in 2026, visitation to Washington will double over the average year. So we have a lot to prepare for. And I think it's a wonderful thing that our national Capitol grounds are lined with museums dedicated to science, history, art, and culture. It says a wonderful thing that as a nation, we're dedicated to knowledge, and we honor it by placing museums on the National Mall. So we are very privileged to be there. It also creates, frankly, something of a burden because of the expectations that will be placed upon us. But of course, that also creates an enormous opportunity, which we are very much hoping to fulfill. I was around, my personal Smithsonian story began in 1976 in the celebration of the bicentennial. And I was in elementary school at the time. No, wait, I was in college at the time. I was in college and spending my summer in DC, and there was this wonderful festival on the National Mall celebrating the bicentennial of the US. I do think, though, that we missed an opportunity in 1976 because it did seem to be so focused on Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, and not so much in the rest of the country. And I think that's a shame, and I hope that we will do it differently this time around. I'm very interested to know, so what was happening in these different parts of the country in 1776? Because in a sense, although they're not part of the documentary founding of the country, the things that were happening there at that time certainly inform and help us understand the things that are happening in those places now. So let me talk a bit about the Smithsonian's plans. Secretary Bunch has given us 4 objectives to try to meet. First is to commemorate and to honor the people who have built the United States. And by that we mean both the great and the common. We wish to contemplate and to reflect on the price of our greatness and consider the work that remains to be done to perfect our union. Third, to commit, or perhaps rather recommit, to our shared values of freedom and equality and the democratic system. And finally, and importantly, to celebrate. The United States is exceptional in what it has accomplished, and we should celebrate that fact even as we humbly acknowledge our human frailty. We should celebrate that our country, more than any other, was and is a global project where people from all over the world have come to build a mighty nation. And we should celebrate what we can be. We are attempting to build the world's first democratic, multicultural, multiracial, humane meritocracy. When it feels as though that project may be on hold, we must remind ourselves that so great an objective was never going to come easily, and that we must continue to aspire and work toward that perfect union. And that's why we should celebrate our nation, which in the end, and we must always remember, is still young. Perhaps we've only played the first quarter. So when I hear the doomsayers say, oh, this could be the end, no, not at all. We are just beginning. So as for the Smithsonian plans, obviously, we're going to have a major party on the National Mall. We will have an expanded Folklife Festival, not quite as expanded as 1976. But the idea there is to represent as many cultures, faiths, regions, colors, and origins as we possibly can. And our message is very simple. We're saying that this, all of this, is the United States of America, and isn't it beautiful? Sorry, my fingers aren't sticky enough. We'll, of course, have any number of 250 themed offerings. For example, our National Museum of Natural History is creating an exhibition called 250 Objects of Wonder. And at my own National Museum of the American Indian, they're working on an interactive called What's Your Treaty?, where a visitor from anywhere can touch their hometown and up will pop the treaty with the tribes that originally occupied that space. We intend to activate our dormant arts and industries building with a visitor center, with a variety of programming, and convocations on some of the great issues that the country is facing. Just as important is the work that we'll be doing off the National Mall. Now, we're present in many places through our Museums on Main Street program, administered by our Traveling Exhibition Service, through our Smithsonian affiliates. We have north of 200, and we'll be working with them. But we also want to develop more regional partnerships to share content. Now, we're not quite sure how we're going to do that, to be perfectly honest. But we do know that it just won't do for us to show up and say, boy, have we got a deal for you, but rather to go out and work with local and regional institutions and say, how can we be helpful? How can we make the most of the resources of the Smithsonian to help you tell your story? And then, of course, we'll have a variety of things online. One we're kind of trying to figure out how to do is to invite people. Most of us have been to the Smithsonian at some point in our lives, right? Either in 8th grade or when you take your children there, or maybe, in my case, my grandchildren. And, but everybody has a story about their first encounter with the Smithsonian. And so we want to invite people to tell us their story and have those available online. So we're looking forward to that. And we'll be just doing so much more. Each of the museums has its own plans. Our various research centers are doing the same, and so it will be a lively year in 2026. But we also want to use 2026 as a launch pad for ongoing work with cultural and scientific institutions across the country. One of the things the Secretary discusses quite often is that we can't limit ourselves to being a New York and Washington institution. Our theory of generating attendance up to this point has been to unlock the doors in the morning. And that's fine, and we're so grateful for all the people that come to the Smithsonian. But that means we're not reaching a lot of the country. And we want to find ways to do that, and the obvious way is to work with regional partners. Cliff also asked me to talk a little bit about telling truth in a troubled time, shall we put it that way. You know, it's occurred to me, and it occurred to me when I was director at the NMAI, that American institutions have been under attack for some decades. And we've slowly seen the erosion of confidence in the Congress, in the media, in universities, in the Supreme Court, and even the military. These things were revered when I was a kid. And these days, I don't think any of them are above water on their approval rates. Now, this is partly because of this information revolution and the democratization, for better or worse, of information and the ability to generate content. I heard Scott Stevenson talking about conflict entrepreneurs. I really like that. I still call them trolls, but if we want to be polite, they're conflict entrepreneurs. But those institutions also suffer because they made mistakes. And I think a great many of those mistakes can be assigned to a lack of candor and to a lack of humility. And these are very important qualities for us. So how do we avoid that fate? It was inevitable that the culture wars and the penchant for undermining institutions would reach our museums. And here I will call upon my experience as a museum director myself, and at times I will be channeling Secretary Lonnie Bunch, who's the best museum guy I know. So here are the things we talk about. First, our content must always be grounded in sound scholarship. Visitors are not interested in our opinions. As Matt Williams told us, they want facts. Second, we should not shrink from controversial subjects. Our job, though, is to give the visitors what they need to make up their own minds, facts and context. It never works to tell people what to think. Third, we should invite visitors into a conversation, not a lecture. We should be saying, let's help each other understand what's going on here. My favorite example is the Americans exhibition at the National Museum of the American Indian, where a visitor enters a room where there are all this imagery, actually not unlike that, where Native Americans appear and have appeared since the beginning, since colonial times. So much so that they become wallpaper in a sense. And so we treat them as wallpaper. It's on all the walls. And we don't have to slap them in the head and say, isn't this awful? But rather we say to them, this is weird, right? So let's figure it out. Let's talk about it and help each other understand how this happens and what the consequences are. And we've had great success with that exhibition. Next, we should embrace the complexity. We should never, ever dumb things down. And we should embrace ambiguity, because sometimes it's just not obvious what the answers are. And finally, we must be humble, and we must admit there are things we don't know, things we don't understand either. And again, invite the visitor to think about these things with us. Now, at the Smithsonian, we're very fortunate because we can view history through so many different lenses. We have a National Museum of American History. We have a National Air and Space Museum. We have a National Museum of Natural History. All of those can tell American stories. We also have a National Museum of African American History and Culture. We have a National Museum of the American Indian. And most recently, Congress has established a National Museum of the American Latino and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. So that gives us the opportunity to tell the same story or describe the same events, but through very different lenses. And I'll give you an easy example. We're near Jamestown. Well, for an African American, you might say the most significant thing to happen at Jamestown was the importation of enslaved people from Africa. For a Euro-American, you might well say the most significant thing is it was the birth of a mighty nation. For Native Americans, their dispossession and impoverishment commences with the arrival of Europeans at Jamestown. Now, the important thing is that all of these perspectives are valid, and all of them are true. And we should learn to get comfortable with these competing realities because they are true. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. Nevertheless, we certainly must try. It is a joy, really, to be among people who are storytellers, people who are committed to telling these interesting, complicated, wonderful, terrible stories, as those of us who work with history do. We all have an American story. So, for example, I am the great-great-grandson of 10 Bears, the Comanche chief who made a peace treaty with the United States. I'm also the grandson of Shield Chief, a Pawnee warrior who fought the Nazis and was grievously wounded at Monte Cassino. I'm also the grandson of white people named Richardson and McGee, whose ancestors came to the US in the 19th century and who raised families during the Great Depression in rural Oklahoma. My parents had a biracial marriage, a marriage that, by the way, would have been illegal in Virginia at that time. They became civil rights activists who fought to desegregate my hometown of Lawton, Oklahoma. And they gave me and my sisters privileged lives that allowed us the opportunity to thrive, all of them. And only in America is that really possible. So all of us here have a great American story. And so do those who visit our museums, have great American stories. And we all love our country. So 2026 is an opportunity to re-inspire our people and make real the promise of the United States. So with that, I'll say that I'm honored to be here with you. I'm honored to be doing this great work with you. And I thank you for your attention this morning.